Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lucas and today's presentation will thematize the differences in political ideology. Primarily we'll be focusing on the biological and psychological differences between political conservatives and political liberals. I will try to introduce you to some of the most promising research and thoughts on the question, how are political beliefs shaped and how can they be so different within a society? So probably you remember the 2016 US presidential election. A majority voting for Trump took a lot of people by surprise given his unprofessional behavior. But Christopher Federico, social psychologist at the University of Minnesota, says it resulted from a long period of evolution in terms of how and why people in the United States identify with different political parties. So, the work on identifying the factors of difference in political ideology can be split up into these subcategories or in these different scientific approaches, if you will. First, we have social psychological biases, so motivational, affirmational, confirmational biases. And we got biology, the biological approach. So we're going to look at the brain structure and also differences in brain physiology. Then it's not very scientific, but can also see differences in the mindset between liberals and conservatives. And last but not least, personality, which is kind of in between the biology and social psychology section. So the comparison of conservatives and liberals, respectively, if you look at the political parties that represent this ideology in the United States, you have the Republican and the Democratic Party, also symbolized by the elephant and the donkey. But in general, the comparative studies try to answer the question, is there an innate difference between conservatives and liberals? So, just to clarify, the goal is to understand the distinct differences between the two, but not picture one political orientation or ideology as superior or better. So, all we talk about here are correlational studies, which means if I say something, a statement about conservatives or respectively liberals, I don't imply or postulate a causal connection, it's just correlation. So if I say conservatives are more blah blah blah, it means they're statistically more likely to have this trait or have this characteristic. So we're starting with biology or biological approach. So when the brains of dead liberals and conservatives were examined, this is what they found. Liberals, here shown in red, conservatives in blue, liberals showed a greater volume of the anterior cingulate cortex, which connects the limbic system with the cognitive prefrontal cortex. The limbic system has a rather primitive function, so it's only for safety measures, while the cognitive prefrontal cortex has an executive function. So this is where we solve complex problems. The ACC detects conflict between instinct and intention, and weighs between competing or conflicting choices, and also kind of calculates the opportunity costs. So you could say that the ACC controls the emotions that are triggered by the environment to allow the executive function, so allow cognitive processing to function on a higher capacity. In contrast, or on the other side, Republicans, conservatives, showed a greater volume of the amygdala. The amygdala responds to stimuli with an uncertain outcome. So it triggers the emotion of fear, threat, because there's an uncertainty. You cannot prepare for this problem. It's also responsible for fear-based learning, so it's a way of being conditioned through the activation of the amygdala. It also is associated with a behavior or an approach towards conflicts or risky situations of avoidance. So you could say conservatives, looking at it from a biological, neurobiological perspective, they are more likely or more sensitive to these threatening stimuli. In a study by Schreiber and his colleagues, liberals and conservatives were observed through functional MRI, so their neural activity was observed, while they had to undertake a risk-taking task. So it was a risky task, and it included 3 numbers that were shown for 1 second each on a screen, and all participants of this experiment had a button in front of them. So, and if you press the button during the presentation of the number 20, it would result in a gain of 20 cents. 40, there was a probability of either losing or winning 40 cents, and the same thing for 80 cents. So you could either lose or win these 80 cents. So the probabilities of either losing or winning were balanced, so the probabilities were predetermined, so there was no statistical edge, so no advantage to one of the numbers. So there was no winning strategy, if you will. So in another study showing conservatives and liberals different images, positive and negative images. So negative images were, for instance, showing people eating worms or open wounds. I just drew a worm. And the positive images were showing little bunnies or children smiling. So the findings should suggest that conservatives look at the negative images longer. In a very similar study where there were also shown positive and negative images, but this time they evaluated the percentage of what images they could remember. It also showed a kind of a negativity bias towards conservatives, because they remembered 91% of the negative images, but only 80% of the positive. In contrast to the liberals, where you can see they remembered more of the positive images. So you could argue that there is at least a little negativity bias on the conservative side, but actually it doesn't make sense. If we remember the amygdala, if the amygdala kicks in, of course a negative stimuli is much more sensitive for a conservative brain. So physiologically speaking, they're more sensitive to negative stimuli in their environment. In doing twin studies, the genetic influence on the perception of major political issues was investigated and therefore subcategorized into these 3 sections. Each one represented by a continuum, and these are pretty much dichotomies. So, first, resources. Should the social redistribution be focused on the individual or the whole? Is integration more perceived as a threat or an opportunity? And should be the structure of power organized, should it be organized in a hierarchy or rather egalitarian structure? So what they found is that 40% of the variation in these three categories can be predicted by the DNA of your parents. So this is an alternative explanation for the high correlation between political affiliation of parents and their children, so that it matches. Earlier it was suggested to be the parenting style that influenced the political affiliation of the children. Also with social psychological explanations that this was also reinforced by selective exposure. So being raised with conservative values would make you confirm the ideology of conservatism because you have a selective perception of reality. So, in conclusion, biological markers associated with risk-taking can be a very solid predictor for political ideology, and this highly correlates with a political affiliation. So you can pretty much predict with 40% certainty what an individual is voting. Mindset. According to Stern, liberals and conservatives differ in their sense of themselves in relation to others. So liberals are caught up in what he calls false uniqueness. This is often represented by their desire to be and think in a unique way. So they underestimate the chances of other people sharing their beliefs because they like to think that they're unique. While conservatives tend to overestimate the number of people sharing their beliefs. It's called false consensus. Looking at stereotypical political goals of liberals versus conservatives, such as innovation, social justice reform for liberals, in contrast to conservative goals, law, social norms, border security, it's pretty clear that what they have in common. So liberals prefer novelty and conservatives give preference to stability and maintenance. Evaluating differences in cognitive styles showed that liberals have a higher need for cognition, so they like to think and like to update their thoughts all the time. The conservatives have a need for closure, which is basically the opposite. They like their principles in place and avoid disconfirming evidence. So you could say liberals are approach motivated and conservatives are avoidance motivated. Before this presentation ends, I just wanted to mention the research linking personality profile to political ideology using the Big Five trait theory. I just thought it was worth a mention and I couldn't cover it because of a lack of time. Thank you for your attention, guys. I hope you got a little understanding of the psychological and biological markers of political ideology.